Okay, welcome students. So in this class I will be talking about the various social developments of the time and link it directly to the text that is the prologue to the Wife of Bath's Tale. So let's just begin. So the major developments of the time, what were the major developments of the time? That is during Middle English period of England or in medieval England when Chaucer was writing. So the major development, something that happened and very important phenomenon was that 1348, 9 and 1361 the bubonic plague happened. In England, the bubonic plague ravaged England. The scale of the great plagues, even though it was difficult to imagine what was the scale of the plagues, in some parts of the country they killed almost everybody, while in England as a whole, something more than 30% of the population died. The effect of a disaster on this scale is very large. Had been very hard to envisage, to visualize, if not for the fact that we are really living in time of a pandemic. So everybody saw the potent images of death. People became superstitious. People became aware of the unnatural elements in life that was causing death, something that is outside of the normal. So everybody saw some potent images of death. Everything became a symbol of death, as death was the only normal thing that was happening during that time. So there were infected houses that were burned, there were carts full of corpses, and the pits, that is pits in the ground, used as mass common graves, something that we have actually seen even in this year, the last year as well. So everyone lost either friends or relatives. Medieval society believed in providence. That is, everything that happens according to God's will. So the medieval society was a firm believer in providence. And it is not surprising, therefore, that the plagues were thought to have been brought by God. They were sent by God as a warning of coming judgment. Like it happened in the Bible, like it happened with Christ, like he brought flood, upon his resurrection. The response of many people was to turn with new energy to reform. They wanted to stamp out, push out corruption, and they wanted urgently to re-establish a better and a good society. And as such, what happened was that a movement came into place, something that was attacking the corruption in the church and was inspired by a man called John Wycliffe. He was an Oxford scholar, a scholar of Oxford, a very important figure. John Wycliffe, who was an Oxford scholar, his writings and preachings, they questioned the authority of the Pope, the church, the clergy. He denounced, he completely let go of, denounced, that is, he condemned, vehemently charged, attacked the corrupt practices in the church, and he suggested the idea of a conscience. The fact that you should have conscience, a sense of right and wrong, of principles, which could be and should be judged by the individual and not the church, not the clergy, which was thoroughly corrupted. Wycliffe also began to translate the Bible into English so that ordinary people could more easily understand the scriptures. He himself seems to have had faults as a reformer, though Wycliffe was at faults as a reformer. He held livings where he was not a resident. For example, he had pursued a self-interested career in church for much of his life. Nor did he organize a quote-unquote movement as such, for his followers were largely learned men from fellow Oxford scholars they were, and the controversy over his works was a scholarly affair. Scholars were questioning what Wycliffe was opinionating about. Nevertheless, Wycliffe's ideas achieved some publicity, while many poorer priests and members of the clergy they followed his doctrines and spread the reforming idea. Even some poorer priests who did not, they were poor because they did not participate in the corruption, or they were poor because the corrupted system of the church kept some among them marginalized, as it happens in every sector, in every case and scenario. So there were even members of the clergy who supported or who followed Wycliffe's books and his doctrines, and they spread it around them. They spread it around, that is. And Wycliffe and his reforming clergy were called the Lollards. And in Chaucer's time, they were very, very important. They were a significant influence all over the country, all over England. Many of the virtuous traits of Lollardry, okay, many of the virtuous instances of this Lollardry, they are incorporated in the Canterbury Tales, through the tale of the Parson's Tale, যদি আমরা পড়ি, then we will find that a lot of virtuous influence of the Lollard movement is included in this tale. And of course, Chaucer, a person of the time, would definitely use it as a source for all his tales. It created his general worldview, his general principle of writing, his general aesthetic of writing, which he followed, which influenced his writing, which influenced his philosophy. And therefore the parson is someone who dislikes personal gain and whose particular virtue is in setting a good example of humility and the hard work to his followers. So the plague accelerated economic changes as well by bringing about a shortage of labor, which enhanced the power of serfs. Who were the serfs? The serfs were unpaid laborers, synonymous to slaves, who worked for the landed aristocrats, the estate owners. So when people died in huge numbers because of the plague, the serfs gained a lot of power because there was dearth, or there was some lack, there was insufficiency of manpower, of people who will work. So these people who were slaves hitherto, who were very much tormented and tyrannized hitherto, since their number became shorter and shorter, the people who remained, the workers who remained, they gained a lot of power. Because rich people, they really, really absolutely need the poorer sections in order to create profits, in order to make them work so that their businesses can run. Even in the modern capitalist world, this is how it happens. Like trade unions are there in order to ensure the worker's life should be of dignity. So the shortage of labor caused by the plague enhanced the power of serfs and enabled them to gain new freedoms to better their class, to better their lot. In this volatile situation, a rebellion took place. What was the rebellion? The Peasants' Revolt, a very important event in the history of England. The Peasants' Revolt that happened in 1381. It was apparently an expression of anger at poverty and injustice and desire for greater freedom. And these are the factors that flared the fire for this rebellion. And it spread to several countries very quickly, and several groups of rebels They converged, they came together at London, and the young King Richard II, they had to negotiate with them in order to calm down the rebellion and save his capital. Among the leaders of this rebel were three whose names we still know. They're not important directly in connection to the tale, but I'll just mention their names. They are Wat Tyler, John Bull, and Jack Straw. Although by modern revolutionary standards the peasant revolt was a minor episode, without any hope of, it did not look forward to overthrow the feudal government, but it was a foundational stone for the future workers' rebellion that would happen throughout the entire world. That is, so even the 19th century workers' revolution, or the Marxist taking over of our conscience of markets, that is, as it introduced that rebellious, the mode through which the workers can rebel and acquire just positions in the society. The peasants' revolt, it was the foundational stone for what was to come in the future years. And Chaucer himself travelled widely through Europe. He saw active service. He was taken prisoner and ransomed in 1359 or 1360s. He probably served in Picardy with Lancaster, that is, he was a courtly servant in 1370s. He was also sent abroad on various diplomatic missions. He travelled to France, he travelled to Italy twice. He was an avid reader and quickly absorbed the new writings and ideas he found in France and Italy. And I have already mentioned how he was influenced, how he was inspired from various works of Boccaccio and Dante, from Guillaume de Loris's Roman de la Rose, which he translated into English. The church's stranglehold, the church's very firm grasp on art and thought of people was being weakened by a renewed interest in the pagan cultures, not in the Christian cultures, in the pagan cultures of Greece and Rome, which did not follow the lines of Christianity. And the rapid progress of trade and exploration encouraged an exciting climate in which the democratic ideas and social criticisms flourished. As you move away from the center of control to various places, which can both be a new mode of conquering, like the English explorers did, but it can also be a new mode of relief, of escaping the central stranglehold, the central grasp on your neck of freedom. So as people started exploring, as people started trade, as they visited various places, they crossed over various geographical boundaries, the mind also exploded its circumference, the collective minds of people. And as the church's stranglehold became weaker, with people being interested historically in the pagan cultures of Greece and Rome, thereby undermining the church's authority. Mind you, they are not undermining religion, they are undermining the church's authority, which always looked forward to have a quick fist grasp on art, on what is known as art, on what is known as culture, on what is known as freedom, because it was the controlling authority. So with this we can see that the society was changing. Chaucer, in effect, he travelled into the European Renaissance and brought many exciting ideas and attitudes back with him to England. The English court was also changing. It was becoming increasingly conscious of fashion. And very curiously we find that Chaucer goes to great lengths. He takes great pains to describe the physicality of the travelers, the sense of fashion that they inherited, that Chaucer exposes to the readers. sampling from people who basically represent almost all sections of the society. Chaucer has also provided us with a history of change of fashion. So the English court was also changing. He was becoming increasingly aware of fashion after the accession of Richard II, of Richard II. Richard II in 1377. The court's extravagance under Richard was a matter of concern to the parliament. So Richard II was a very childlike king, and he was an extravagant ruler. That is, he liked to spend a lot. He liked to maintain his status symbol with various materials that was bought by money, and as a people's money, of course. রাজার তো নিজের কিছু থাকে না, সবই তো প্রজা. So the court's extravagance, under Richard was a matter of huge concern to the parliament while he was still only a boy. Court ceremony increased with a greater emphasis on elaborate dress and affected manners, of course. This atmosphere encouraged the English to import fashion and artistic forms from the continent. In the general prologue, that is the general prologue to the Canterbury Tales, the contrast between the knight and the squire shows us basically a generational gap. এই দুটো গল্প যদি কবিতাগুলো যদি তোমরা পড়ো, প্রথমে নাইটস টেল, যেটা দিয়ে ক্যান্টারবারি টেলস শুরু হচ্ছে, আর তারপরেই যদি তোমরা স্কোয়ার টেলটা পড়ো, সরি, you will find that the knight is an older gentleman while the squire is a young lad in his 20s. So the way that both of these people, they describe the world that they see, that they perceive, and the way Chaucer describes their physical appearances, it basically exposes a generation gap. And a generation gap existed as great as we can see even now as well. And the general prologue also describes an absurd imitation of a court pomp by guildsmen and their wives. That is, merchants and tradesmen and their wives, they also participate or conform to, they imitate the court pomp, the court parties, basically the court revelries, very absurdly. Their imitation is quite absurd, and we find the description in the general prologue as well, and it shows that the court was also having a profound and formative influence on the town society. So no longer were there indivisible or permanent boundaries or permanent walls that separated the town from the court. Something that we saw was the separation which was quite prominent in the play that we read together of Shakespeare, between the town and the court. So over here we see in medieval England, the boundaries, they are just falling over right now. The walls between the court and the town, they are falling, they are crumbling down slowly. As we see that the court was heavily influencing the town society. Social historians point to the rapid growth of trade as increasing, an element of interest in the Wife of Bath's prologue and tale as well, of trade, that is. So trade, there was a rapid growth of trade as increasing communication between different parts of Europe at this time, and accelerating the spread of new attitudes. These social historians also point out to these transformations. Growing trade increased the ranks of the new urban class, something that I have mentioned, the new urban class that was rising, the bourgeoisie. So trade helped this class to grow, helped this class to come into prominence. while there was an accompanying decline in the value of land. So no longer were the estate holders more and more important, as business now spilled over the geographical boundaries, and there were traders and merchants, and a new class of people who were emerging as power holding in the society. The economic power of the traditional gentry, of the traditional aristocrats, whose wealth was in their very lands, in their very estates, they were completely undermined. And one of the clearest example of the new middle class that we find in the Canterbury Tales is the Franklin's Tale. The character of the Franklin. He is described as a tradesman who used commercial success to buy an estate, to buy land, and held influential offices as magistrate and sheriff in his area. It was relatively new in Chaucer's time. So, with the social mobility, that is, rising up the social ladder from one class to the other, from the lower to the upper class, it was relatively new in Chaucer's time, but its growth was very rapid. Understandably, the rigid structures of church and the feudal state, it began to crumble in the face of reform and change. So as you can see, there were huge transformative changes that was happening during Chaucer's time, before or during Chaucer's time. So the medieval society, or the medieval England, was changing from medieval to modern. মডার্ন মানে কিন্তু আমি কন্টেম্পোরারি, মানে সমসাময়িক আধুনিকতার কথা বলছি না। যেই পরিবর্তনগুলো সেই মিডল ইংল্যান্ড সোসাইটিতে আসছিল, সমাজে আসছিল, সেইখানে যেই পরিবর্তন আসছে ওই সময়, ইন দ্য কনটেক্সট অফ দ্য টাইম, ইন দ্য কনটেক্সট অফ দ্য সোসাইটি, those changes, those new attitudes were modern. So as a result, we see forming two separate viewpoints. The one will be the medieval view and the other will be the modern view of the world, that is. So in the medieval view of the world, every creature and thing had a purpose and a preordained place. Something that I think that I had mentioned before, that is, the world order was changing from being a theocentric world to an anthropocentric world. That is, the medieval view was that the cause of all purpose and order was God, and all religious matters were under the authority of the Roman Church. So there was God, who was causing all purposes and everything that was happening, because he was the one who was bringing order into this world, creating this world, that is. And his doctrines, God's doctrines, they were handled by another authority, that is the Roman Church. God also presided over a secular edifice, and the secular edifice was the king. So if I just take this diagram in a better fashion, so there is the king, who is the representative. There is a king and his subjects. The king is ruling the subjects. The king in turn is ruled by God. God has ordered, the king works through the God, that was the thought. So we can see that then God occupies the king's circle as well, that is the subjects of the king as well. And God's teachings, they were indoctrinated by, or all matters of God, that is related to God, to religion, they were presided over by the Roman Church. So as you can see, the Roman Church was the authority that encompassed every sector of the society, not God, neither the king. So it was the church that was the foremost authority in medieval England. So this is the medieval view. Sorry. This is, of course, a simplified picture of the medieval thought, details of Amijaini, and the two hierarchical structures they control could not be questioned. That is the authority of the Pope and the King. The Church and the King, they were the most important entities, and they were working through the principles of God. A consequence of seeing every person fitted into this rigid social structure was that individuals, all of these people who are scattered around, the individuals, they are completely outside of this equation of power. Private hopes and despairs were thought to be insignificant in comparison to this grand scheme of thought. So these little dots of individuals, they did not matter much at all. As I was saying, private hopes and despairs were thought to be insignificant in comparison to the grand order in which they were held either a very, very important place or a very lowly place. Both of these can happen. It can be difficult for us to understand how trivial an individual's feelings seem in the medieval world. They did not matter for one bit. Modern thought pays attention, but on the other hand, modern view pays attention to the individual. The individual's desires, the individual's despair, the individual's successes, the individual's failures. The modern view takes into consideration the individual as a primary unit of the society. A good example of the medieval view, that is the view that we are talking about, a good example of this medieval attitude occurs in another work of Chaucer. I have mentioned this work, Troilus and Cresside. The story of Troilus' tragic passion is over, towards the end that is. When he dies, his perspective on life changes completely, and his soul sees the world from the medieval point of view for the first time. So his individual view of the world, it is waning out, it's becoming blurry as he is dying, and for the first time he sees the world from the medieval point of view. Troilus rises to the stars where he hears sounds full of heavenish melody. And I will put the quote on the screen. So Troilus is dying and he rises to the stars where he hears sounds of full of heavenish melody. And he says, and down from thence fast he gan abyss, this little spot of earth. So he's witnessing earth from above. That with the say embraced is the earth being surrounded by sea, and fully gan despise this wretched world. So he, viewing the world from a medieval point of view, is despising this wretched world that is the earth, and held all vanity to respect of the plain felicity that is in heaven above. And Troilus now chooses the plain felicity, the plain ease of life that exists in heaven. In literature, one consequence of this rigidly ordered view of the world, so this world that is very rigidly ordered, when you see kind of class mobility, social mobility is not something that is something that is new, something that is being injected into the medieval England slowly, step by step. So how does literature represent this? How does literature deal with the rigidity of the society? One consequence of this rigidly ordered view of the world was that in literature, the development of the characters, they were also very much schematic. the characters in medieval texts, literature, they are not unique individuals, they are not eccentric individuals. Like the characters which we will find in the future, uh, types of fiction, such as in Dickens, such as in D.H. Lawrence, they are not eccentric or very individualistic. That is, instead they are types. They are character types of characters, and often they had some particular moral significance. These character types, they signified certain morality. An enormously fat man with glittering eyes, for example, would represent the sin of gluttony, যেটাকে আমরা হ্যাংলামি বলি, gluttony. Or the character of Piers, that is Piers the plowman, first semester history মনে করে থাকো, Piers the plowman, William Langlander লেখা, the character of Piers, he stands for honesty and hard work. So characters like these show little individuality, and their importance is in their sins, in the sins and virtues that they represent, and they are called allegorical characters. These types of characters having a moral significance, having a moral signifying certain moral attitude, certain morality, who are important not because of their subjectivity or individuality, but because of the sins and virtues that they represent. So they are called allegorical. And Chaucer's audience would recognize the stock figures, that is the types, from the way they were described. Chaucer often drew on this, this storehouse of character types that he had. However, we will find that his character's individuality developed far beyond than what Chaucer intended to, than what the society in which it was written, the society allowed it to. The character's developmental arc has crossed all boundaries. More complicated and precise definitions of characters could be drawn from the intricacies, from the systems of astrology. A mass of information about someone's character is gained from working out their horoscope. The influences of various planets in different conjunctions with each other, they add on to the characterization. Chaucer refers to astrology frequently in the Canterbury Tales, and even the Wife of Bath's horoscope has been dealt with exhaustively or very intricately or very minutely by Chaucer in the tale of the Wife of Bath. A second system for analyzing characters according to the medieval view was medieval medicine. There were thought to be 4 humors. এই মেথডটাকে এই হিউমারসের দ্বারা আর কি ক্যারেক্টার অ্যানালিসিসকে হিউমারালিজমও বলা হয়. So this was another system of analyzing characters in the medieval viewpoint. So they were thought to be 4 humors or natural juices in the body. And in a healthy person, these fluids were supposed to be present in balanced quantities. That is, not one juice exceeds in quantity within a person than the other. So, and any excess of one or the other fluid or of the humors, it was thought it led to illness. So each humor was associated with 2 qualities and with one of the 4 elements of which all matter was thought to be composed. So each of the 4 humor was composed with the 4 elements of earth, fire, water, air. In theory, that is, each person held In theory, each person held a natural, slight excess of one or the other humor, any humor. And this determined their dominant behavior, their dominant characteristic trait, their dominant character. Medical beliefs, they were also associated with planets and colors. So here again we find it's a very complicated scheme, able to express subtle variations within a character, within a person, that is. We have already come across an example while we were reading the prologue. The wife of Bath portrayed in the general prologue, যখন wife of Bath কে introduce করা হচ্ছে, a portion that we have read together, Chaucer describes the wife as red of hue, that is red of color, and her hosen, that is her hose, were of fine scarlet red. Chaucer's audience would immediately recognize these traits, this description, these colors, as a sign of a character who is dominated by the humor of blood. There were 4 humors, one of them was blood, and the way Chaucer describes the wife of Bath, she is dominated by the humor of blood. And Chaucer's audience would have easily deduced, they would have come to the conclusion that the wife's quick temper and strong but somewhat inconstant feelings, her feelings are not constant but very strong opinion, she has very strong opinions, she has very strong feelings. So the audience would have quickly characterized her type, the type that she falls in, as a sanguine type of character. That is a character who is very self-assured. So that is why she has strong emotions and feelings, but they are inconstant somewhat. And even the physical features were considered in order to understand the character. So the wife of Bath, who is cat-toothed, something that I have mentioned before while we were reading the prologue, so the wife of Bath, Chaucer points out that she was cat-toothed, and he expected the pilgrims to understand this as a sign of lechery, যেটাকে আমরা খুব কমন টার্মসে ক্যারেক্টারলেস বলে থাকি, lechery, as in a promiscuous nature she has. The main point that we can understand now is the characterization from a medieval point of view. It was a complicated system evolved to describe the variety between human beings. But as we can see and easily conclude that this system relied on a rigid framework of beliefs, ultimately religious and moral order, royal and papal, that is of the Pope, authority of the Pope or papal authority. They bounded everything, and the medieval person saw or felt they were all of these bound. What the medieval person saw and felt, they were all rigidly bounded by the religious moral order, royal and papal authority. Everything and everybody had its own structural place, a place in the structure. An immobile structure it was, an immobile place it was. Wife of Bath's place is very carefully defined in these terms. And however much we try to deduce her or come to a conclusion with her, in our modern way, we might be tempted to excuse her, we might be tempted to even take her side according to our own modern view. But we must never ignore the medieval view of her that Chaucer is at pains to reveal in her prologue and tale. Chaucer describes her, creates her through a medieval point of view. So So we must never forget that, even if we want to and if we do interpret her with modern attitudes. Now let's see what the modern view is as opposed to the medieval view. The modern way of looking at the world requires less explanation, since it is essentially the same attitude that we have even today. However, let's just mention a few points. First, we think about a character our main interest lies in this case, the wife of Bath, and what makes her unique, what makes that person unique. Their eccentricities, their individuality, their classification into their types. What makes them unique? We are fascinated by their dreams, hopes, loves, and hates, and we interpret irrational actions in terms of tension, conflict, emotional stress, using modern psychology's idea of subconscious with the development of Freudian interpretations of dreams. The details and variants are not important right now. The main point is that we believe in the value, sensitivity, and significance of individual people. This contrasts with the medieval point of view, which sees the world and all man's concerns as vanity, something that we just read in the last lines of Troilus and Cresside. So from the modern point of view, everything else follows from the importance of the individual. The individual becomes very important in the modern view. Unlike the medieval view, which was dominated by structures created by the king, then the god, then the authority of the Roman Church. We believe that the cleverest and the greatest people rise to the highest position in our modern attitude, through our modern attitudes. A hard-working man will be making a lot of money. All through our upbringing, we are told it depends on you. If you want to be a lawyer, doctor, president, it's up to you. In this way, we underline our belief that the social and moral order of the world is determined by human individuality. And in our literary characters, we celebrate the inner lives of individuals. So this is directly opposed to the medieval theocentric view or God-centered view. This is more, the modern attitude is more of an anthropocentric view, that is human-centric, individual-centric. And when we are addressing Chaucer, or when we try to understand Chaucer, we must not be biased with any one point of view. We must not take a partiality toward any of the two opposing philosophies. We tend to think that, quite patronizingly, quite oppressively, we think that the serfs, they did not have any idea of equality. We ask the other question as well, how many modern young people really can go out to become doctors, lawyers, and presidents? This surely is just as much an illusion as the medieval belief that the serfs were born inferior. The medievals, the Middle Englanders, they believe that the serfs are born inferior, therefore they need to be struck and they need to be stuck as well in their own rigid structure of oppression. Chaucer's mind is liberal enough to see the truth and falsehood in both the medieval and modern outlooks. And that is where his originality lies, that is in his ability to weave a web, to blend the elements of both the views together. And in this way, he creates a complex reality and provokes thought, and does not give any superficial or facile or very flat answers to the problems of life. He gives complex answers to the complex questions of life. And it is from this standpoint that sees a much more complicated reality than either of the. It is only from this standpoint that we can assess the complications of reality. By not simplifying the reality to one point of view, from one view, by not looking at the world from one view, And this is also how we should approach the character of the wife of Bath, the story, the literature, the prologue to the wife of Bath, and also the wife of Bath's tale. And during these changing times, during this time of transformation, the wife of Bath raises two major questions. Now we come directly to the text. So the wife of Bath, she raises the prologue, the tale, both, and we will be addressing the wife of Bath's character from uh, the context of both the prologue and the tale. কারণ একটা থেকে আর কি ক্যারেক্টারাইজেশন করা হয় না. I will be stressing giving more importance to the prologue because that is the text that we have in concern. But at the same point of time, the complete characterization of wife of Bath does not end with the prologue. It is just an introduction to the wife of Bath. So we will take our understanding of the tale as well, the wife of Bath's tale as well. তো তোমরা আমার মানে এই লেকচার্সের মধ্যেই যতটুকু ইনফরমেশন সেখান থেকে টেলের থেকে পাচ্ছ, you can include only those in your answers. There is no need for you to overstudy. There is no need for you to go and read and analyze the wife of Bath's tale as well. I will be doing that for you. So just keep in mind that the characterization is not complete with the prologue. It continues for a few more 100 lines into the tale. So coming back to the thing that I was saying, the wife of Bath raises two major issues. What are the two major issues? Sexual and love relationships within marriage, becomes an issue. And the next is the quality of nobility. The quality of nobility, মানে nobility আদৌ ন্যায্য কিনা সেটার assessment. The quality of nobility or gentleness. Wife of Bath calls it gentleness, যেটাকে আমরা বলি. These are the two major issues that the wife of Bath raises, and we will be studying these two issues as well. So taking the first into consideration then. So here we begin a very elaborate understanding of an important theme in the prologue, that is love and marriage. So the first being love and marriage. The first theme being love and marriage. In Chaucer's times, there were two predominant ways of viewing, only in two ways the relationships between the man and a woman could be seen. First was through the institution of marriage. The institution of marriage was not confused with romantic feelings as it is now. It was an unquestioned part of the social and religious order, and it was there for social and financial security and for procreation. Alison of Bath, Alison the wife of Bath, was first married when she was 12 years old. Her husband was a rich old man. This was an explicit bargain. It was a trade-off basically. Her youth, Alison's youth, beauty and fertility, they were traded for the husband's money. Alison's family would also have taken into account that the groom was likely to die of old age quite quickly. Such crass, very crude trading in young girls as wives, slaves, they would not shock Chaucer's audience. এটা আমাদের এখানেও হতো. যদি ওই সতী প্রথার দিকে আমরা আবার ফেরত চলে যাই, আমরা দেখবো যে মানে ওখানেও কিন্তু এরকম একটা পলিটিক্স হতো, ইচ্ছে করেই আর কি. ব্রাহ্মণবাড়িতে যেটা হতো, ব্রাহ্মণবাড়ির মেয়েদেরকে ইচ্ছে করেই প্রচণ্ড থুড়ে বুড়োদের সাথে আর কি বিয়ে দেওয়া হবে, আর যে মরে যাবে, তখনকার দিনে কিন্তু বাংলায় আইন ছিল যে স্বামী মরে যাওয়ার পরে তার সম্পত্তি কিন্তু তার বউ পেতে পারে. তো ওটা আইনত ছিল আর কি. মানে এখন ধরো ওটা এক্সপ্যান্ড হয়ে পুরোটাই যাকে খুশি আর কি দেওয়া যায় অ্যাজ এ গিফট, অ্যাজ অ্যান ইনহেরিটেন্স। বাট তখনকার দিনে আর কি বউকে বা বাড়ির মেয়েকেও আর কি ইনফ্যাক্ট দেওয়া যেত আইনতভাবে, তারপরে ওটা অ্যাবলিশ করে দেওয়া হয়েছিল। সো অ্যাজ আই ওয়াজ সেইং, যে ব্রাহ্মণ বাড়ির মেয়েদেরকে, বাচ্চা বাচ্চা মেয়েদেরকে অত্যন্ত অত্যন্ত বয়স্ক লোকেদের সাথে, ভদ্র লোকেদের সাথে বিয়ে দেওয়া হতো, যাতে তার খুবই তাড়াতাড়ি মারা যাওয়াতে তার সবই ধন সম্পত্তি ব্রাহ্মণ সমাজ অ্যাট লার্জ ভোগ করতে পারবে। তো ঠিক সেরকমই মিডিয়েবল ইংল্যান্ডেও এখানে হচ্ছে, ট্রেড অফ ইজ হ্যাপেনিং। And Chaucer's audience would very much be aware of this as a fact. It was simply part of the accepted order of society. In addition, marriage gave the husband almost unlimited power over his wife. She was his property to do with as he liked. Though this could vary according to the power of her family, and as well, how powerful a family does the wife, does the woman belong to, that also comes into question in a different order though. On the other hand, ideas of courtly love had gained some prominence and fashion in Chaucer's time. It was popularized in courtly romances imported from France. Again, I will mention Chaucer's own translation of the Romaunt of the Rose about courtly love. The courtly lover is a type we recognize more easily in the present day. His love for his lady is a kind of adoring worship, like the Petrarchan sonnets which we were talking about while reading As You Like It. His love for his lady is a kind of adoring worship. He feels himself so unworthy that he falls ill, and in theory will die of heartbreak, will die out of love if she does not take pity on him. If she shows pity, he then dares to offer his service and undertakes battles and tasks for her glory, for her. At this stage, she may begin to think that he is worthy, and if he shows himself loyal and deserving, this may kindle her love for him and lead her to grant him her favor. মানে হাজার একখানা পেট্রার্কান সনেটস ঠিক এরকমই স্ট্রাকচারে তৈরি, আর হাজার একখানা শেক্সপিয়ারের সনেটস এই স্ট্রাকচারটাকে ভেঙে চুরমার করে দিয়েছে। So you can read a few of Shakespeare's sonnets and compare it to Petrarchan sonnets as well. The historians still argue about how much influence this courtly love had on day-to-day manners in medieval times. However, the supposed courts of love presided over by Eleanor of Aquitaine and Mary of Champagne in the 12th century poeters gained legendary fame. What the courtly love, whatever was the face of it in the courts of these people, Mary of Champagne and Eleanor of Aquitaine. They gained legendary fame, and courtly literature grew and spread. We can of course obviously distinguish clearly between modern characteristics, clearly distinguish certain modern characteristics in courtly love. First, the individual's emotions are indulged and involved, and they become more important than life or death. Second, the lover's worship is woman-centered. She becomes a faultless idol, taking the place of God. This system also directly contradicts both the man's authority in marriage. For in courtly love, the woman is at power, the woman has more authority, and its own idealism also. This system also attacks its own idealism, the fact that you are considering another individual, a woman, to be perfect, an idol. Basically, you are idol worshipping and nothing else. So courtly love is a paradoxical ideal. It is antithetical. It is inclusive of opposites inside of it. For with all the worship and exaltation of womanhood, the ultimate aim of the lover is to possess and so conquer her. I will share a material with you along with this video lecture which discusses The Wife of Bath as a marriage group of tales, something that comments upon love and marriage in the society. And I will also send you a comparative material in which you will be able to compare the other marriage tales in the Canterbury Tales. কম্প্যারিজন করলে, অ্যাসোসিয়েশন করলে ওয়াইফ অফ বাথের চরিত্রটা আরও বেটারভাবে বুঝতে পারবে। ইউ ক্যান আউটলাইন her differences from the other tales that are grouped together as a marriage group of tales. So I will send the materials to you. I will not discuss them in class. You can read them from the material, very easy to read. So the next important issue that the wife of Bath puts into the forefront is the theme of, or the issue of, as I pointed out over here, the issue of gentillesse. Okay, so the theme of gentillesse is developed in the wife of Bath's prologue and tale as a debate between old and new values. Debate between old values and new values. There is no modern equivalent of the word gentillesse, but nobility and virtue, these words give an idea of what gentillesse means. The traditional view was that gentillesse was inherited, like estates, money from estates, your royal surname, noble surname. So nobility was something that was inherited. Gentillesse was inherited, and was thought that so were the virtues. Virtues were also inherited. The medieval view saw it like that. And the more genteel your family, the higher you were born in the social scale, the greater your nobility and virtue would be. This fits the medieval view of an ordered society, of course, with social ranks rigidly fixed and superiority passed down through heredity, whether or not you are actually superior from the educational point of view, from literacy point of view, from economical point of view, moral point of view, ethical point of view, social point of view. None of these come into considerations in the medieval point of view of gentillesse. That believes, the medieval point of view, it believes, the society believed that virtue and virtue is inherited like nobility. It follows the rigid social structure which was the structure of medieval England. The modern view argued by the old woman in the wife of Bath's tale. Wife of Bath's tale, there is an episode where we find an old hag, quote unquote, an old hag or a very old woman commenting upon love and marriage. So I will just brush over it. The modern view is argued by the old woman in the wife of Bath's tale is that gentillesse is a quality of noble goodness that people show by living good lives. She argues that gentillesse can be found equally among rich and poor. So if gentillesse is virtue, then virtue does not see social rank. You do not inherit virtue by blood, by the mere name of your father. So that is why the old hag puts it into perspective that it is very much about people showing by example, by living good lives. Gentillesse can be found easily among the rich, both among the rich and the poor, for virtues come from God, not our parents. So we can see at once how much more contemporary and democratic this view is, and how it fits the new attitudes that we have just seen together. And we will discuss these themes in a bit greater detail in the next video that I upload on Classroom. So if you find any problems in this lecture, please come up to me with your questions. I will be happy to solve them. Thank you very much.